My name is Mireille Ashbourne, and I'm 58 years old. At my wife Cassia's funeral, the whole room bowed under the weight of grief while I sat rigid in the front pew, counting the silence between sobs. In my briefcase beside me rested a quiet stack of royalty notices the estate lawyer had delivered just days before. Numbers that changed everything. I watched mourners file past Cassia's casket, their faces wet with tears, and I said nothing about what I knew. After the service ended, I left without speaking to anyone and sat alone in my car. The envelope felt heavy in my hands as I pulled it out again, studying the figures that seemed impossible. $280,000 in back royalties from songs Cassia had written decades ago. Songs I'd helped publish when we'd worked together, before she'd stepped away from the industry. A decision formed in that car, sitting in the funeral home parking lot with rain beginning to fall. I would not tell my son Rowan about this money. Not yet. Not until I understood what Cassia would have wanted, and what Rowan truly deserved. The estate lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, had handed me the full accounting the week before Cassia died. She'd been in hospice, unconscious, unable to tell me herself about the money that had accumulated in a forgotten account. There's also a property, Pemberton had said, sliding another document across his desk. A house in Cape Breton she inherited from her aunt 15 years ago. Never sold it, kept paying the taxes quietly. I'd been stunned. Cassia and I had shared everything, or so I'd thought. But these secrets, they weren't deception, I realized. They were protection. Insurance for a future she knew she wouldn't see. At the funeral, Rowan cried openly over the flowers, his friends circling around him with phones raised, capturing his grief for social media. 26 years old, and he'd turned his mother's death into content. I watched him pose for sympathetic selfies and felt something cold settle in my chest. I tucked the royalty letter deeper into my coat pocket and forced myself to smile when he approached me, asking what we'd do with Mom's stuff. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Rowan wanted answers immediately. He cornered me at the reception, his hand trembling on mine, asking about bank accounts and assets and future plans. We need to figure out the house situation, he said, meaning our Toronto home where I still lived. And whatever Mom left. We should get organized. His eyes were dry now, the performance over. I looked at my son and saw someone I barely recognized, someone who viewed his mother's death as a logistics problem to solve. Not today, Rowan, I said quietly. He frowned, frustrated by my refusal to engage. But Mom, we need to plan. I've got expenses, and you'll need help managing everything. The presumption in his voice, that I needed help, that he deserved access, that Cassia's life's work was somehow his to claim, made betrayal simmer under my skin. I pulled my hand away gently. Your mother just died. Give it time. His face darkened, but he nodded and walked away. I watched him rejoin his friends, already laughing at something on someone's phone. The betrayal burned hotter. Cassia deserved better than this casual dismissal of her memory. Back at home that evening, I couldn't sleep. I wandered into Cassia's study, a small room off our bedroom that had been her sanctuary. Her desk still held scattered papers, old notebooks, the organized chaos of a creative mind. I opened the bottom drawer carefully and found what I was looking for, her old ledger of songs. Cassia had kept meticulous records of every piece she'd written, every contract she'd signed, every royalty payment she'd tracked. The notebook was worn, its pages filled with her looping handwriting and scattered notes in the margins. I traced my fingers over the dates, remembering songs that had meant something once. Warm notes beside titles, written for M on our anniversary. This one always made her laugh. Cassia had left me clues throughout this ledger, I realized. Instructions hidden in casual observations. And on the very last page, written in blue ink that looked recent, was a single line that made my breath catch: protect the child who needs it. Not the child who wants it. The child who needs it. I understood then what she'd meant for me to do. Rowan took over the funeral arrangements with a brisk efficiency that felt more like ownership than grief. He'd hired a photographer to document the wake, insisting people would want memories. He'd invited his influencer friends, people Cassia had never met, who posed tastefully beside the memory table and posted tributes that rang hollow. I watched from across the room as Rowan directed the photographer toward better angles, adjusting flower arrangements for optimal lighting. He never once looked at the photo display I'd created of Cassia's life, her work with the battered women's shelter, her volunteer music therapy sessions at the children's hospital, her quiet acts of generosity that had defined her character. Instead, he focused on creating a narrative that centered himself, the grieving son, the tragic figure worthy of attention and sympathy. None of it felt real. None of it honored the woman Cassia had actually been. I waited, hoping Rowan would notice the quiet, real things his mother had loved. He didn't. He was too busy performing grief to actually feel it. That night, I began to understand the distance between the son I'd raised and the man standing in my living room. I couldn't sleep again, so I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and drafted trust documents in my head. Not for Rowan alone, that much was clear. Cassia's money needed to serve her values, her vision, the things she'd cared about when she was alive. I would steer her royalties toward the places and people she would have wanted to help. The battered women's shelter where she'd volunteered every Thursday for 10 years. The music therapy program she'd started at the hospital. Young musicians who needed support and couldn't afford lessons. But I kept one secret clause, something I drafted and redrafted in my mind throughout the night. A red line I would not cross until I was ready to teach Rowan the lesson Cassia would have wanted him to learn. That inheritance wasn't entitlement. That money carried responsibility. That his mother's legacy meant something beyond his bank account. I wrote notes in the margins of my notebook, crossing things out and revising, until dawn light crept through the kitchen window. By morning, I had a plan. Cassia's money would do good in the world. And Rowan would learn what it meant to truly honor her memory, whether he wanted to or not. A week after the funeral, Rowan found Cassia's old journals, the personal ones, not the song ledgers. He brought them to dinner at my house, flipping through pages while I cooked. "Listen to this," he said, laughing. "Mom wrote about meeting you like it was some romance novel. MS hands on the piano, fingers dancing like prayer. So dramatic." He read more entries aloud, mocking the romantic language, the sincerity of Cassia's private thoughts. Each word he ridiculed felt like a small knife. I stood at the stove, stirring pasta, and said nothing. But I listened. I listened to my son dismiss his mother's inner life as romantic nonsense, and I made a decision. That night, after Rowan left, I logged into the account where Cassia's royalties had been deposited. I started a scheduled withdrawal plan. Small amounts at first, untraceable to anyone who wasn't looking carefully. Slow, quiet, invisible transfers to the organizations Cassia had loved. If Rowan wouldn't honor his mother's memory with respect, I would honor it with action. The first transfer was $5,000 to the women's shelter. More would follow. Rowan would never know until it was too late to stop me. My first significant transfer sent $20,000 to the battered women's shelter where Cassia had volunteered. The director, Elena, called me in tears. "Mireille, this is extraordinary. We can finally expand our counseling program." I felt Cassia's presence like a warm pressure on my wrist, approving, guiding. That same afternoon, Rowan messaged me about a luxury car he wanted to buy. "Just need a down payment, Mom. 10,000. I'll pay you back once I get my inheritance sorted out." The casual assumption that money was coming to him, the confidence that he deserved it, made my jaw tight. I typed back carefully, "Not tonight, Rowan." 3 words that felt like drawing a line in the sand. He responded with a string of confused emojis, then nothing. I knew he was frustrated, but I didn't care. Cassia's money would not fund his luxury purchases or his entitled lifestyle. It would fund the things she'd cared about, supporting women escaping violence, bringing music to sick children, creating opportunity for people who actually needed it. Each transfer I made felt like justice. Like Cassia herself was guiding my hand, showing me who really deserved her legacy. Within 2 weeks, rumors spread through our extended family and Rowan's social circles. Cassia had money. Substantial money. Suddenly, distant cousins I hadn't heard from in years started appearing. Calls, emails, casual visits that weren't casual at all. Everyone wanted to express their condolences and, not so subtly, inquire about the estate. Rowan's phone exploded with messages from opportunists who'd never cared about Cassia when she was alive. One woman from his contact list, someone named Margot who I'd met once at a party, sent him a long message asking for a loan to tide things over during a rough patch. I saw the text when Rowan's phone sat on my kitchen counter. He'd replied too quickly, too eagerly, "She's family. We'll help her out." But Margot wasn't family. She was barely an acquaintance. And Rowan was already spending money he didn't have, making promises he couldn't keep, all based on an inheritance he assumed was his. I noted each name carefully. Every person who came sniffing around for money. Every false friend who suddenly remembered Rowan existed. I kept a file on my desk, documenting the vultures circling my wife's estate. Cassia would have been disgusted by all of them. I hosted a small reading of Cassia's poetry at our home for neighbors and her real friends, the people who'd actually known and loved her. It was modest and quiet, just candlelight and voices sharing her words. About 30 people came, sitting in our living room, passing around her notebooks and reading verses that had meant something to Cassia. It was beautiful and sincere, exactly the kind of memorial she would have wanted. Then Rowan arrived late, slightly drunk, and disrupted everything with a loud, clumsy toast about legacy and what we all owed to family and how his mother would have wanted everyone to live big. The room's mood snapped like a broken string. People looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances. Cassia's best friend, Sarah, whispered to me, "I'm so sorry, Mir." I smiled tightly and guided Rowan toward the kitchen, away from the gathering. But the damage was done. I remembered every slight Cassia had swallowed during our years together. Moments when people had dismissed her work, undervalued her contributions, treated her generosity as obligation. I wouldn't let her death become another opportunity for people to take without appreciation. The file on my desk grew thicker that night with notes about Rowan's behavior, time-stamped and detailed. A tax notice arrived for the Cape Breton house, demanding immediate payment of overdue property taxes. Apparently, Cassia had missed the last payment before she got sick. Rowan saw the notice on my kitchen table and panicked. "We need to sell it immediately," he said, "before we get hit with penalties and interest." He'd never seen the house, didn't know where it was, had no idea what it meant to Cassia. But he'd already decided it should be sold. The next day, he pressured me publicly at a family brunch, raising the topic in front of my sister and Cassia's brother. "Mom's being difficult about the Cape Breton property. It's in all our interests to liquidate assets quickly." The way he spoke about Cassia's house, liquidate assets, made me want to scream. Instead, I smiled calmly and said, "I'm not selling." The table went quiet. Rowan's face flushed red. "That's not your decision alone," he said. I met his eyes steadily. "Actually, it is. The house is in my name. Cassia transferred it to me 3 years ago." A lie, but one he couldn't easily disprove. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words. I'd won that round, and we both knew it. That night, Rowan's girlfriend Lila came to visit me alone. She was nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup at my kitchen table. "I saw some lines in a will," she whispered. "Rowan showed me. There's significant money." I studied her carefully. "Did he show you an actual will, or did he tell you what he thought was in it?" She hesitated. "He said his mom left everything to you both equally." More lies spreading like infection. The truth was Cassia's will left everything to me, with instructions I could interpret as I saw fit. But Rowan had created a narrative that suited him better, one where he was entitled to half of everything. Lila continued, his making plans. Big plans. Business investments, property purchases. His counting on that money. I felt cold all over. My son was building castles on foundations that didn't exist, and worse, he was spreading false information to justify his expectations. That night, I called Mr. Pemberton and had him tighten the trust conditions even further. No distributions to Rowan until he demonstrated genuine understanding of his mother's values. No access to information until I decided he was ready. The trust became a fortress, and I held all the keys. A stranger named Victor Reese called my home phone, claiming he was entitled to a share of Cassia's songwriting revenue. He spoke quickly, professionally, citing a contract Cassia had signed 23 years ago with a small music production company. "I purchased the company's assets 5 years ago," he explained, "which includes rights to a percentage of royalties from Ms. Ashbourne's catalogue." My stomach dropped. I asked him to send documentation, and 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived. The contract was real. Cassia had signed away 15% of her royalties in perpetuity for a small upfront payment when she was desperate for rent money early in her career. It was an exploitative contract, the kind that predatory companies use to trap young artists. Cassia had fought this alone for years, I realized, probably paying this man without ever telling me because she was ashamed or frustrated or simply too tired to explain. I hired a lawyer immediately to review the contract for loopholes, anything that might invalidate it. Cassia's royalties weren't going to enrich some vulture who'd bought old debt. Not if I could help it. I hired an accountant named Patricia Chen, a woman with an iron reputation for protecting artists' estates from exploitation. She reviewed Cassia's contracts with sharp efficiency, finding problems everywhere. "These are unconscionable," Patricia said, tapping the Victor Reese contract with her pen. "Signed under duress, minimal compensation, perpetual rights. We can challenge this." We spent 3 weeks building a case, documenting everything. Meanwhile, I quietly rerouted suspect payments to community programs Cassia had loved. The music therapy program at the Children's Hospital received an anonymous $50,000 donation. A scholarship fund for young female songwriters received $30,000. Each transfer felt like reclaiming Cassia's work from the people who tried to exploit it. Rowan's voice grew shriller during this time, calling me repeatedly to ask about when we'd settle things. But he didn't suspect what I was actually doing. He thought I was just being slow and difficult. He had no idea I was systematically dismantling his expectations while building the legacy his mother actually deserved. Patricia smiled grimly when we finished the redistribution plan. "Your wife would be proud," she said. I hoped that was true. At a family lunch 3 weeks later, Rowan finally confronted me directly. We were at a restaurant with my sister and her husband, and Rowan raised his voice loud enough that nearby tables turned to look. "You're hoarding money like a dragon," he said, his face flushed with anger and wine. "Mom left that money for both of us, and you're sitting on it. I have opportunities. I have a startup idea that needs investment. I have plans." His entitlement was breathtaking. I set down my coffee cup very slowly and met his eyes. "Not yet, Rowan." 2 words, quiet but firm. His face lost color. "What do you mean, not yet? When? When will you stop controlling everything?" My sister touched my arm gently, trying to de-escalate, but I shook my head. "When you understand what your mother's legacy actually means," I said. "When you can talk about her without reducing her to dollar signs. When you demonstrate you'd honor her memory instead of spending it on luxury cars and business schemes." The table went silent. Rowan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud across the floor. "You're unbelievable," he said, and walked out. I watched him go and felt no regret. Only certainty that I was doing exactly what Cassia would have wanted. 2 days later, my bank manager called, confused and concerned. "Ms. Ashbourne, we've received petitions signed by several individuals claiming they're entitled to access accounts associated with your late wife's estate." My blood ran cold. Who signed these petitions? He read names, distant cousins, people I barely knew, and worst of all, Rowan's signature prominent at the top. My son had tried to orchestrate a legal challenge to access Cassia's money. He'd recruited relatives with promises of shares if they supported his claim. It was betrayal at a level I hadn't imagined. I drove to the bank immediately with Mr. Pemberton, carrying legal paperwork that proved the trust's integrity and my sole authority over Cassia's estate. The bank manager reviewed everything, his face growing red with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. These petitions have no legal standing. We should never have contacted you about this." But I was glad he had. Now I knew exactly how far Rowan was willing to go. He wasn't just expecting inheritance, he was actively trying to steal it. That night, I documented everything. Every signature, every false claim, every attempt to undermine Cassia's actual wishes. They were playing at theft wrapped in legal language, and I had proof. I flew to Cape Breton alone the following week, needing space to think and to see the house Cassia had kept secret. It was a small cottage overlooking the ocean, weathered but stubbornly beautiful. The key was where Mr. Pemberton said it would be, under a rock shaped like a heart near the front door. Inside, everything was exactly as Cassia had left it during her last visit 5 years ago. Photographs on the walls, books on shelves, her handwriting still visible on the pantry door marking the heights of someone's children, probably her aunt's grandchildren. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and opened the envelope Mr. Pemberton had given me, marked to be read at the Cape Breton house. Inside were letters Cassia had written to me, about the house, about her plans for the money, about what she wanted her legacy to be. "This house is for healing," she'd written. "For women who need safety and space to rebuild. For artists who need quiet to create. For anyone who needs refuge." She'd outlined everything, how the royalties should be used, which organizations to support, and most painfully, what to do about Rowan. If he's still the boy we raised, give him everything. But if he's become entitled and cruel, teach him first what generosity means. When I returned home, Rowan had learned about some of my transfers. Someone at the women's shelter had mentioned the donation publicly, thanking an anonymous benefactor. Someone at the hospital had posted about the music therapy program's expansion. Rowan had connected the dots and realized where Cassia's money was going. He raged on social media, posting a long, bitter message calling me a monster who was stealing his inheritance to play philanthropist. "My mother's estate is being looted by someone who thinks she knows better than family," he wrote. "Money that should support her son and grandchildren is going to strangers." The comment section exploded. Hundreds of people lined up to judge me, calling me controlling, selfish, cruel. Others defended me, arguing that Cassia's money was Cassia's to direct as she wished. The public battle was ugly and painful. But I let it happen. I let people see Rowan's entitlement on full display. I let them witness his belief that he deserved money more than the women escaping violence or the sick children getting music therapy. The truth would emerge eventually. For now, I let him show everyone exactly who he'd become. A reporter from a local paper called asking for my side of the story. I hesitated, then agreed to a sit-down interview. I told her the truth, not the whole truth, but enough to change the narrative. I explained that Cassia had been a songwriter and music publisher who'd cared deeply about supporting vulnerable people. That her royalties were a tool for good, not a commodity to be divided among relatives who'd never supported her work. I showed the reporter photographs of Cassia volunteering, letters from people she'd helped, documentation of her years of quiet generosity. The piece ran the following week with the headline "Protecting a Legacy, Widow Honors Late Wife's Vision." It framed me as a steward rather than a hoarder, someone faithfully executing Cassia's wishes against pressure from entitled family members. The public response shifted dramatically. Suddenly, people understood that this wasn't about denying Rowan money, it was about honoring Cassia's values. Comments under Rowan's angry posts turned critical. "Your mom sounds amazing. Maybe listen to what she actually wanted." The tide had turned, and Rowan felt it. Rowan confronted me in Cassia's study late one evening. He'd let himself into the house with his old key, and I found him standing at her desk, hands shaking. "You could have told me," he said, voice raw. "You could have explained what you were doing instead of shutting me out." I placed Cassia's ledger on the table between us. The one with all her songs, all her notes, all her instructions about protecting the child who needs it. "I told you when it mattered, Rowan. But you never heard. You were too busy performing grief on Instagram and calculating your inheritance to actually listen." His face crumpled. "That's not fair." I opened the ledger to the pages where Cassia had written notes about her hopes for him, her fears about his materialism, her wish that he'd grow into someone generous and thoughtful. "Read these," I said. "Read what your mother actually thought about money and legacy and responsibility." He grabbed for the ledger, but I moved it away. "Not until you're ready to really see it." He stared at me, eyes wet with frustration or grief or maybe both. Then he turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood alone in Cassia's study and wept. I decided it was time to make Cassia's real legacy public. I invited her oldest friends to the Cape Breton house for a small ceremony. About 20 people came: Sarah, Elena from the shelter, musicians Cassia had mentored, volunteers from the hospital program. We stood on the porch overlooking the ocean, and I revealed what I'd been planning for months. A memorial scholarship in Cassia's name for young women in music programs. $50,000 annually, in perpetuity, funded by her royalties. The house itself would become a retreat center for artists and women in crisis, a place of refuge and creation exactly as Cassia had envisioned. A plaque would hang by the door with Cassia's name and her values carved in wood. Rowan's name was not on the plaque. He hadn't earned the right to be part of this legacy. Sarah posted photos from the ceremony online, and they went viral. Hundreds of shares, thousands of comments praising Cassia's vision and my stewardship. Rowan saw the posts. He called me that night, silent except for breathing on the other end. Then he hung up without speaking. The message was clear. He finally understood what he'd lost. The public pressure mounted after the ceremony. A distant cousin named Graham, who'd signed Rowan's petition to the bank, filed a court motion to open Cassia's estate for review. He claimed I was mismanaging funds and that other relatives had rights to portions of her royalties. The motion was legally baseless, but it required a response. Mr. Pemberton and I prepared carefully, gathering every document that proved Cassia's intentions. The hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Rowan emailed me during that time, his message pleading and confused. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Can we please talk?" But I waited. I wanted the truth to come out in court, with witnesses and legal clarity, so there could be no more confusion about what Cassia had wanted. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was surprisingly full. Relatives hoping for money, reporters covering the story, friends supporting me. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Thornton, reviewed the preliminary motions with sharp efficiency. Then she asked if anyone wanted to present testimony. I stood slowly and asked permission to read Cassia's will aloud. The judge nodded. I read every word of the document Cassia had drafted herself. Protective, precise, leaving everything to me with specific instructions about supporting vulnerable communities. The will was clear and legally unassailable. Cassia had written detailed clauses about her wishes, explicitly stating that no family members beyond me had claims to her estate. She'd even included a line that made my chest ache: "I trust Mireille completely to honor my memory in ways that matter." The judge studied the document carefully, then looked at Graham and the other relatives who'd filed the motion. "This will is explicit and properly executed," Justice Thornton said. "There's no basis for your claim. Case dismissed." Graham's face went red with frustration, but he had no recourse. Rowan sat in the back of the courtroom, his face registering shock and something that looked like shame. He'd expected the law to be a fast path to entitlement, a way to force me to distribute money according to his expectations. Instead, he'd met his mother's foresight, her careful planning, her clear instructions that he'd ignored while she was alive. After the hearing, relatives filed out angry and empty-handed. Rowan approached me slowly in the hallway. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Not today. But soon." He looked older somehow, diminished by the reality that had finally caught up with his assumptions. 3 months passed before Rowan came to visit me again. He called first, asking permission, which was new. When he arrived, he carried his infant nephew, Lila's sister's baby, awkward and unprepared but trying. "Mom," he said softly, settling into Cassia's favorite chair. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything." I waited, saying nothing. He continued, "I saw the community projects. The scholarship applications that came in. The women staying at the Cape Breton house." He'd gone there without telling me, I realized. He'd seen what Cassia's money was actually doing. There's a girl, 14 years old, who got the scholarship. She's incredible. Writes songs about her grandmother, about memory and loss. She posted a video thanking Mom, thanking you for making her dream possible. His voice cracked. I didn't realize what any of this meant. I just saw money as something I was owed instead of something that could actually matter. The baby squirmed in his arms, and he adjusted his grip carefully. Lila's pregnant, he said. We just found out. And I keep thinking about what kind of father I want to be. What kind of legacy to leave. He looked older now, humbled by reality and responsibility. The last line of Cassia's ledger had become my final move, the one I'd been saving. I pulled out the envelope she'd left specifically for Rowan, marked with his name in her handwriting. She wanted you to have this, I said, handing it to him. But only when you were ready to understand it. Rowan opened the letter with shaking hands and read silently, tears streaming down his face. I knew what it said. I'd read it weeks ago. Cassia had written about her hopes for him, her fears about his materialism, her absolute conviction that he could become someone generous and thoughtful if he chose to be. I left you the world, Rowan, she'd written at the end. But only the world you can steward, not the one you can consume. Money is responsibility, not reward. Legacy is what you build, not what you inherit. He read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and tucked it into his pocket. I want to help, he said finally. With the scholarship, with the house, with whatever honors her properly. Not for money. Just to be part of it. I studied my son, really looked at him for the first time in months, and saw genuine understanding in his eyes. Then let's start, I said. The quiet justice Cassia had wanted had finally arrived, not through punishment or deprivation, but through the slow, painful process of teaching someone what truly mattered.